The screen is black. We hear the sound of a heavy, waterlogged splash, followed by eerie silence. The image fades in. A floral, three-seater sofa sinks slowly, almost gracefully, into the crystal blue water of a suburban swimming pool. Bubbles erupt from the cushions like last breaths. Voiceover. Karen, voice trembling but resolute. They said it was about the rules. The color of my mailbox, the height of my grass. But it was never about the rules. Quick cut. A perfectly manicured woman in her late 50s, Brenda, stares at her phone, her face contorting from disbelief into pure rage. Voiceover. Karen. It was about breaking me. The sofa hits the bottom of the pool with a soft, dull thud. A single throw pillow detaches and floats to the surface. Voiceover. Karen. They picked the wrong woman to break. The splash had been satisfyingly loud. A violent cannonball of grief and defiance that echoed across the manicured lawns of the Cypress Creek estates. Now silence. Karen Sterling stood on the edge of her pool deck, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs that was part terror, part exhilarating triumph. The late afternoon sun beat down, making the chlorinated water glitter around the submerged frame of what had been her husband's favorite sofa. It looked absurd, a domestic shipwreck in the placid blue of her backyard. It was a monstrous, beautiful, unforgivable act, and it was all hers. She hadn't planned it. The day had started like all the others since David died 6 months ago, with a suffocating quiet and another crisp white envelope from the Homeowners Association slid through her mail slot. This one was for improperly stored refuse containers. Apparently, her trash bins had been visible from the street for a full 18 minutes past the 9 a.m. Tuesday deadline. Fine. 75. It was the 7th fine in as many weeks. The first had been for the unmowed lawn in the days after the funeral. Then the slightly faded paint on the shutters. Then the wind chimes David had given her, their gentle music now deemed a persistent auditory nuisance. Each notice felt like a paper-thin slice taken from her soul. Each was signed with the same looping, aggressive signature, Brenda Mae Collins, President, Cypress Creek HOA. Today, something had snapped. She'd been trying to move the sofa, the one David had died on, his hand clutching her own as the hospice nurse quietly slipped out of the room. The memory was embedded in the floral fabric. It was too heavy to move alone, and the sight of it, sitting there so empty, had become unbearable. The HOA's letter was on the counter. The pool was just outside the sliding glass door. The thought had appeared in her mind, fully formed and shockingly clear. If they want to find me, let's give them something to find me for. And so, with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength she didn't know she possessed, she had pushed, heaved, and finally tipped the 300-pound monument to her marriage over the edge. Karen? Oh my God, Karen! The voice, shrill and laced with the gossipy horror that powered the neighborhood, belonged to her next-door neighbor, Cynthia. She was standing at the low hedge that separated their properties, a cordless phone pressed to her ear. Her eyes were wide, her mouth agape. Karen knew, with sickening certainty, who was on the other end of that call. Karen didn't answer. She just stared at Cynthia, a strange calm settling over her. Let them come. She didn't have to wait long. Less than 10 minutes later, a golf cart screeched to a halt on the sidewalk in front of her house. Brenda Mae Collins disembarked with the stiff-backed fury of a drill sergeant inspecting a latrine. She was dressed in tennis whites, so pristine they seemed to hum with fluorescent light, a matching visor perched on her helmet of lacquered blonde hair. She didn't bother with the front gate. She stormed down the side of the house, her keds crunching on the gravel path, a clipboard clutched in her hand like a weapon. What in the name of God have you done? Brenda's voice was low, seething with a rage that was far more terrifying than a shout. Karen finally turned from the pool. I was redecorating. Brenda's eyes, small and hard, flickered from Karen's face to the submerged sofa and back again. A muscle twitched in her jaw. This isn't a joke, Karen. This is a willful destruction of property and a flagrant violation of at least a dozen community bylaws. Health and safety, property maintenance, aesthetic standards. She ticked them off in the air with a perfectly manicured finger. "It's my property. It's my pool. It's my sofa," Karen said, her voice steadier than she expected. "It's in a community with standards," Brenda snapped. "Standards you agreed to when you bought this house. Standards that protect our property values. Do you have any idea what the chemicals from that cheap upholstery are doing to the pool filter system? Not to mention the visual blight." "It was a very expensive sofa," Karen said quietly. Brenda scoffed, a short, ugly sound. "That's hardly the point. You've been a problem since David. Since he passed. We've all tried to be patient. We've given you warnings, gentle reminders." "Gentle reminders? You fined me because the wreath on my door was for the wrong season. It was March 1st. The wreath had snowflakes on it. Bylaw 11.3 clearly states all seasonal decorations must be removed within 5 business days of the season's conclusion," Brenda recited, her voice devoid of emotion. "The winter solstice was in December. You were given ample time." A hot, furious energy surged through Karen. "My husband died in that house, Brenda. I was a little preoccupied." For the first time, a flicker of something other than rage crossed Brenda's face. It wasn't sympathy. It was distaste, as if Karen's grief were a stain on the neighborhood's pristine facade. "We all have our burdens, Karen. That doesn't give you the right to turn this neighborhood into a junkyard. This is your final official warning. You have 24 hours to have that thing professionally removed from the pool, and you can expect a preliminary fine of $500 for the violation, plus the cost of any and all damages to the community filtration system, should the contamination spread. And if I don't?" The question was out before Karen could stop it. Brenda smiled, a tight, predatory stretching of her lips. It didn't reach her eyes. "Don't test me. You have no idea how seriously we take the integrity of this community. You have no idea how much power the HOA charter gives me to maintain it." She made a neat, decisive checkmark on her clipboard. 24 hours? Karen, the clock is ticking." With a final withering glare, Brenda turned on her heel and marched back to her golf cart, leaving Karen alone with the gurgling silence of her ruined backyard. The triumph she'd felt was gone, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. Brenda wasn't just a busybody. She was a tyrant who wielded the book of bylaws like a sacred text, and Karen had just committed the ultimate heresy. That evening, the official email arrived. The subject line was cold and stark. "Notice of emergency HOA board meeting regarding property at 128 Cypress Lane." Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was worse than she imagined. Brenda hadn't just issued a fine. She had formally invoked Bylaw 714, conduct detrimental to the community, a rarely used clause with terrifying power. The email detailed the willful and malicious defacement of property and the creation of a hazardous and unsightly nuisance. But it was the final paragraph that made the air leave her lungs. Furthermore, given the pattern of escalating violations and the homeowner's demonstrated refusal to adhere to community standards, the board will hear a preliminary motion to begin foreclosure proceedings as outlined in Article 9 of the Cypress Creek Estates Charter. The homeowner's presence is required. Foreclosure. They were going to try to take her house. The house she and David had built, the house where she had held his hand as he left her forever. The room started to spin. Panic, cold, and absolute seized her. Brenda wasn't trying to find her. She was trying to erase her. Despair washed over her, so potent it made her physically weak. She slumped into a kitchen chair, her head in her hands. She couldn't fight this. She was alone. David had always handled this stuff. He was a corporate lawyer, and he'd always called the HOA a tin-pot dictatorship run by bored despots. He'd argued with them, filed appeals, and usually won. But David was gone. Her eyes fell on a stack of dusty boxes in the corner of the dining room. Things from his home office she hadn't had the heart to go through yet. One was labeled simply CCHOA. For months, she'd avoided it. Now, propelled by a desperate, sliver-thin ray of hope, she got up and walked toward it. Her fingers were stiff as she sliced through the packing tape. Inside were years of files, correspondence, and notes. But on the very top was a thick leather-bound journal. Tucked into the first page was a yellow sticky note covered in David's familiar, precise handwriting. It was an arrow, pointing to a single underlined sentence he had written years ago. As she read it, the panic began to recede, replaced by a slow, burning, incandescent rage. Brenda had no idea who she was dealing with, but she was about to find out. David had left her one last weapon. The note said, Article 15, Section 4B. The charter of this HOA was never legally ratified by the county. They're a bluff, all of it. For a long moment, Karen could only stare at her husband's handwriting. The precise, confident strokes were so familiar they ached. They're a bluff, all of it. The words seemed to hum on the page, a message sent from beyond the grave. The despair that had been crushing her moments before didn't just recede. It was burned away by a sudden, white-hot fury, a bluff. For 6 months, this woman, this HOA, had been tormenting her, piling on fines, judging her grief, and now threatening to take her home, all based on a lie. The panic was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity Karen hadn't felt since before David's diagnosis. She wasn't a grieving widow anymore. She was a woman with a mission. Sleep was impossible. Fueled by coffee and righteous anger, Karen spent the night poring over the contents of the box. It was a meticulous archive of David's long, cold war with the Cypress Creek HOA. He had saved every letter, every transcript of every meeting he'd attended, every scrap of paper. He had highlighted sections of the bylaws, written scathing rebuttals in the margins, and cross-referenced violations with county ordinances they clearly violated. It was a complete legal strategy, a roadmap to dismantling Brenda's petty kingdom. In the journal, he had documented conversations with other neighbors, people who had been fined into submission for trifles, a basketball hoop left out overnight, a slightly too bright holiday light display, a political sign that lingered a day too long. He'd been building a case, not just for himself, but for everyone. He had simply run out of time. Not anymore, Karen thought, her hand resting on the journal. I have time. The next morning, she didn't call a pool company. Instead, she was at the Williamson County Clerk's office the moment it opened. The building smelled of old paper and stale bureaucracy. After a half-hour of navigating disinterested clerks, she was pointed toward a dusty, cavernous room filled with filing cabinets and microfiche readers. She gave the clerk the parcel number for the Cypress Creek Estates development. He returned with a hefty file folder, blowing a layer of dust off the top before sliding it across the counter. Everything the county has on that development is in there, he said, already turning away. Karen's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were deeds, zoning permits, environmental impact reports. It took her nearly an hour of sifting through dense legalese before she found it, a document titled Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions for Cypress Creek Estates. It was the original charter. She scanned the signature pages. They were all there, signed by the original developers 20 years ago. But at the very back, there should have been a county seal, a stamp, a signature from a county judge or clerk officially recording and ratifying the document, giving it legal teeth. There was nothing. Just a blank space and a faint penciled-in notation. Pending review of water use variance. TH 61204, David was right. They had filed it, but it had never been officially approved. The variance must have been denied or simply forgotten, and in the intervening 2 decades, no one had ever bothered to check. The entire Cypress Creek Homeowners Association, with its fines, its liens, and its power of foreclosure, was built on a foundation of sand. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Karen's face. She paid the clerk $10 to make a certified copy of the entire file. The emergency meeting was held that evening in the community clubhouse, a sterile beige room that smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner and unspoken resentment. Karen walked in 2 minutes before it was scheduled to start. The entire board was there, seated at a long folding table at the front of the room. Brenda sat in the center, a gavel at her right hand, looking regal and severe. To her right was George, a burly, red-faced man who ran a landscaping business and acted as Brenda's enforcer. To her left was Barry, a wispy, nervous-looking accountant who served as treasurer, his eyes constantly darting around the room. Cynthia, her neighbor, was also there, sitting on the board as secretary, refusing to meet Karen's gaze. About a dozen other residents were scattered in the metal folding chairs, a mix of Brenda's loyalists and others who had clearly been summoned as an audience for Karen's public humiliation. The whispers stopped the moment Karen entered. She didn't look like the disheveled, grieving widow they were expecting. She had taken the time to do her hair and makeup. She wore a crisp navy blue blazer, one of David's favorites that she'd had tailored, and carried a sleek leather briefcase. She looked like a lawyer. She looked like her husband. She took a seat in the front row, placed the briefcase on her lap, and met Brenda's glare with a cool, unwavering stare. Brenda banged the gavel. This emergency meeting of the Cypress Creek Estates HOA is now in session. The sole item on the agenda is the ongoing, escalating series of violations at 128 Cypress Lane, culminating in the willful creation of a hazardous nuisance by the homeowner, Karen Sterling. She nodded at George. He stood up, cleared his throat, and began to read from a prepared statement. On the afternoon of September 21st, Mrs. Sterling did knowingly and with malicious intent deposit a large piece of upholstered furniture into her private swimming pool. In direct violation of Bylaw 714, conduct detrimental to the community. Bylaw 12.1, maintenance of property in an aesthetically pleasing manner. And Health Code 4A. He droned on for several minutes, listing bylaws and codes. Karen let him. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded on her briefcase. The room was thick with tension. She could feel the eyes of her neighbors on her, some curious, some hostile. Therefore, George concluded, sitting down with a thud, I move that the board levy the maximum initial fine of $1,000 and immediately authorize our legal counsel to begin foreclosure proceedings against the property. Is there a second? Brenda asked, her eyes locked on Karen. Barry, the treasurer, nervously raised his hand. I second. The motion has been made and seconded, Brenda declared, her voice ringing with triumph. Before we vote, the homeowner is permitted to speak in her defense. Mrs. Sterling, do you have anything to say for yourself? This was it. Karen stood up slowly. She didn't look at the board. She turned and faced the other residents. My husband David loved this neighborhood, she began, her voice quiet but carrying in the silent room. He loved the trees, the sense of community. He also believed in the rule of law. He believed that rules should be fair and that they must be applied justly. But most importantly, he believed that for rules to have any power, they first have to be real. She paused, letting the words hang in the air before turning to face Brenda. You have fined me for the color of my shutters, for wind chimes, for grieving too slowly. You have harassed me, threatened me, and now you are trying to take my home. You've done this using the authority of the Cypress Creek Estates Charter. She snapped open her briefcase and pulled out the certified copy from the county clerk's office. She held it up. The problem is that charter has no authority, Karen said, her voice ringing with newfound power, because it was never legally ratified by Williamson County. I spent the morning at the clerk's office. There is no record of it ever being entered into county law. It is, for all legal intents and purposes, a worthless piece of paper. A collective gasp went through the room. Barry's face went pale. George's mouth hung open. Cynthia looked like she was about to be sick. Brenda, however, did not flinch. Her face hardened into a mask of pure fury. That is a baseless, slanderous accusation. Our charter is a legally binding document, is it? Karen walked to the table and dropped the certified copy in front of Brenda with a loud slap that made everyone jump. There's the file from the county clerk. Page 47. You'll note the missing county seal and the notation about a pending review. A review that, for 20 years, has never happened. You have no legal standing, Brenda. None of you do. You have no authority to levy fines, no authority to place liens, and certainly no authority to foreclose on my home. For years, you've been running an illegal extortion racket dressed up as a homeowners association. The room erupted into chaos. People were shouting, demanding to see the document. Barry, the treasurer, looked like he was about to faint. Brenda's eyes blazed with a hateful fire. She saw her power, her entire world, crumbling before her eyes. For a split second, Karen saw pure panic in those eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by something far colder. She picked up the gavel, her knuckles white. "This is a ridiculous, desperate stunt by a woman who is clearly unstable," Brenda hissed, her voice cutting through the noise. "This document is a forgery, and this meeting has been disrupted by hysterics. The motion to proceed with foreclosure stands. All in favor?" She didn't wait for a vote. She raised her own hand, glared at George until he sullenly raised his, and then looked at Barry, who was sweating profusely. "Barry?" she snapped. He flinched and shot his hand into the air. Bang! Brenda slammed the gavel down with all her might. The sound cracked through the clubhouse like a gunshot. "The motion passes. 3-0. She shrieked over the din. "This meeting is adjourned." The sound of the gavel's crack hung in the air, a punctuation mark on Brenda's declaration of war. For a moment, the room was stunned into silence. Then, the dam of suburban decorum broke entirely. Brenda, her face a mask of brittle fury, grabbed her clipboard and stormed out through a side door, with George lumbering behind her like a loyal but dim-witted bear. Barry, the treasurer, looked physically ill. He gathered a stack of papers with trembling hands, dropped half of them, and scurried away without making eye contact with anyone. The remaining residents immediately swarmed Karen. The atmosphere was electric. A chaotic mix of anger, confusion, and a thrilling spark of rebellion. "Is that true?" a man in a golf shirt demanded, shoving his way to the front. "Have we been paying fines for nothing all these years?" "She fined me $200 because my kid's tricycle was on the lawn," a woman added, her voice high with indignation. "Can they do that?" "This is insane," another muttered, staring at the certified document Karen still held. "A forgery?" She didn't even look at it. Karen held up her hands for quiet. "I assure you this is not a forgery. It's a public record. You can all go to the county clerk's office and see for yourselves. Brenda's authority, this board's authority, is a house of cards." Her neighbor Cynthia approached her hesitantly, wringing her hands. "Karen, I had no idea. She's just so persuasive." Karen looked at the woman who had called Brenda the moment the sofa hit the water. There was no victory in her eyes, only a weary resolve. "She's a bully, Cynthia." "Bullies rely on people being too afraid to question them. It's time we started questioning." She left the clubhouse and walked home under the perfectly spaced, HOA-approved streetlights. The night air felt different, charged with possibility. Instead of dread, she felt a surge of adrenaline. David had left her the ammunition, and she had just fired the first shot. But she knew Brenda wouldn't retreat. She would retaliate. The next 2 days were a war of whispers. The neighborhood became a patchwork of hostile territories. Blinds twitched as Karen checked her mail. Dog walkers would abruptly cross the street to avoid her sidewalk. She saw Brenda's golf cart making the rounds, stopping at the homes of her staunchest allies, no doubt shoring up her defenses and spreading her version of the events. That the poor, grieving widow had finally cracked, forging documents to justify her destructive behavior. But then, something else began to happen. A casserole dish appeared on her doorstep from the woman whose son's tricycle had been the source of a fine. A quiet nod of support from the man in the golf shirt as he drove by. People who had been fined into silence for years were starting to look at each other, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The seeds of dissent, so long dormant, were beginning to sprout. The official response came on the 3rd day. It wasn't a fine. It was a letter delivered by a courier from a law firm Karen had never heard of, Pruitt, Sneed and Associates. The letterhead was thick and expensive. The language inside was dense with legal threats. It accused her of slander, libel, and tortious interference with contractual obligations. It dismissed her county document as irrelevant and misinterpreted. It gave her 48 hours to issue a formal public apology to Brenda and the board, pay the $1,000 fine, and have the sofa removed. If she failed to comply, they would file a lawsuit seeking punitive damages and an injunction to have her forcibly removed from her home. It was a classic intimidation tactic, designed to make her panic and fold. A week ago, it would have worked. But now, Karen just brewed a fresh pot of coffee and sat down with David's journal. He had anticipated this, too. In a section titled Counteroffensive, he had outlined the exact steps to take. First, she called Arthur Vance, David's old law partner. She explained the situation, from the sofa to the unratified charter to the lawyer's letter. Arthur let out a low whistle on the other end of the line. Pruitt and Sneed. Bottom feeders, Karen, they specialize in scaring little people. David was right, you know. He mentioned this to me years ago. An unratified charter is unenforceable. They can send you all the scary letters they want, but if they ever actually set foot in a courtroom, a judge will laugh them out of the building. They're banking on you not knowing that. So what do I do? Karen asked. What David would have done, Arthur said, a smile in his voice. You hit back. Harder. Armed with Arthur's validation, Karen spent the rest of the day composing her response. It was a work of art. She used David's notes and templates he had saved, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was leading a revolution. She sent her letter via certified mail the next morning, addressed not just to Pruitt, Sneed and Associates, but to every member of the HOA board individually. The letter began by flatly refusing all their demands. It went on to state that, based on the irrefutable public record, the Cypress Creek HOA was an illegitimate entity with no legal authority. Therefore, every fine they had ever levied was an act of fraud. Every lien they had placed on a property was illegal. Then came the counterpunch. The letter formally demanded, on behalf of herself and a growing list of fellow residents she was compiling, a full and immediate refund of all fines collected over the past 5 years, the statute of limitations for fraud in their state. It also demanded that the board immediately cease and desist all collection activities and issue a public statement acknowledging their lack of legal authority. The final paragraph was aimed squarely at the board's weakest link. Be advised, she wrote, that as treasurer, Mr. Barry Klein may bear specific personal, financial, and criminal liability for the misappropriation of illegally collected funds. We have meticulous records. She knew that would send him into a tailspin. David's files included a spreadsheet detailing nearly $100,000 in fines collected over the years, paid by dozens of her neighbors. The fallout was immediate. That evening, Barry Klein showed up at her front door. He was pale and sweating, his wispy hair in disarray. She's lost her mind, he stammered, not even waiting for her to open the screen door fully. Brenda, I told her we had to look into the charter. I told her your husband was a smart man, but she wouldn't listen. A lawsuit? Criminal liability? Karen, I have kids in college. I can't. Did you know the charter was invalid, Barry? Karen asked, her voice cold. I'm an accountant, not a lawyer. I just manage the books. Brenda handled the legal stuff. She said it was all ironclad. He looked utterly pathetic, a man out of his depth and terrified. She wants to double down. She's using the HOA's reserve funds to pay that lawyer. She's going to try and ruin you. She can try, Karen said. You don't understand, Barry pleaded, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It's not just about the rules for her. It's about control, about this image she has of the perfect neighborhood. And you're ruining it. She's taking this personally. He looked over his shoulder as if expecting Brenda to appear out of the manicured hedges. I'm resigning from the board. Effective immediately, I wanted you to know. He practically ran back to his car and sped off down the street. 1 down, 2 to go. Karen knew she had the upper hand, but a legal battle could still take months, even if it was a losing one for the HOA. She needed to end this now. She needed to break Brenda's power not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. The sofa was still at the bottom of her pool, a silent, waterlogged protest. It had started this, and now it would help her finish it. She walked to her computer, a wicked, brilliant idea taking shape. She opened her email, pulled up the Cypress Creek Estates Community Listserv, and began to type. Subject, Community BBQ and Pool Party at 128 Cypress Lane. Dear neighbors, she wrote, it has come to my attention that there is a great deal of confusion regarding the governance of our wonderful community. In the spirit of transparency and neighborliness, I'd like to invite you all to a get-together in my backyard this Saturday at noon. We can discuss the future of our neighborhood as friends and equals. I'll provide the hot dogs and hamburgers. She paused, then added the final, Explosive sentence. P.S. For anyone interested in the legal standing of our HOA, I've attached a certified copy of the community charter from the Williamson County Clerk's office for your review. See you Saturday. She attached the PDF, took a deep breath, and hit send. The email blasted out to over 200 homes. The bluff had been called. The evidence was now public, and the battlefield was no longer a stuff. The morning of the BBQ dawned bright and oppressively perfect, the kind of day the Cypress Creek Estates charter probably had a clause for. Karen moved with a strange, dreamlike calm, arranging folding chairs on her lawn and firing up the grill David had been so proud of. The acrid smell of charcoal starter fluid felt like an act of suburban warfare. For hours she was alone, the silence of the neighborhood pressing in on her. She could feel hundreds of eyes watching from behind closed blinds, the entire community holding its collective breath. She began to wonder if anyone would actually come, if fear of Brenda's wrath would outweigh the tantalizing promise of revolution. Then, at 5 minutes to noon, a car door slammed. It was the woman whose son's tricycle had cost her $200. She walked up Karen's driveway with a determined expression, carrying a large bowl of potato salad like a trophy. "I figured you could use a side dish," she said, her voice a little too loud. "My name's Maria." "Karen," she replied, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you for coming." Maria's arrival broke the spell. A few minutes later, the man in the golf shirt, whose name turned out to be Bill, appeared with a case of beer. He was followed by an elderly couple who had been fined for a bird feeder, and then another family, and another. Within half an hour, Karen's backyard was filled with nearly 50 people. They weren't Brenda's cronies. They were the quiet majority, the ones who had paid the petty fines and swallowed their anger for years. The air buzzed, not with the polite, strained chatter of a typical neighborhood gathering, but with an electric, almost giddy energy. People were openly passing around copies of the charter Karen had printed, pointing at the missing seal, their voices a rising chorus of disbelief and indignation. The sofa, still submerged in the pool, had become an unlikely centerpiece. People gathered around the edge of the water, staring down at it. What had been a symbol of Karen's supposed breakdown was now a monument to their collective defiance. "You know," Bill said, taking a long sip of beer, "my wife always hated our sofa. I'm starting to get ideas." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Karen was flipping burgers when the low hum of an electric motor cut through the party's festive noise. Every head turned. Brenda's golf cart was parked on the street, and she and George were marching up the driveway. Brenda was in her tennis whites again, as if dressed for combat. George's face was a thundercloud. The laughter and chatter died instantly. Brenda stopped at the edge of the patio, her eyes sweeping over the crowd with undisguised contempt before settling on Karen. "This is an illegal assembly," she announced, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Karen calmly placed the spatula on the grill. "It's a barbecue, Brenda, and this is my private property. You're trespassing. Your property is part of a community with rules," Brenda snapped. "You are creating a public nuisance, violating noise ordinances, and your little email, that was libel. My lawyer will be in touch with every single one of you," she added, gesturing vaguely at the stunned crowd. It was meant to intimidate, but the threat had lost its sting. No one moved. "Your lawyer already sent me a letter?" Karen said, walking towards her. "And I sent him one back, along with a copy of this." She picked up one of the printouts of the charter. "This worthless, unratified, legally meaningless piece of paper. You have no authority here, Brenda. Your reign is over. I am the president of this HOA." Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking. "I have a fiduciary duty to protect the property values of this community from unstable, destructive people like you." George took a menacing step forward. "You should listen to her, Mrs. Sterling. This has gone far enough." Before Karen could respond, Bill stepped between them. He was shorter than George, but broader, with the solid stance of a man who wasn't easily moved. "I think you're the one who should be listening, George. We've all seen the county records. The game is up." Brenda's face contorted with a rage so pure it was terrifying. She saw it then, the complete and utter loss of control. Her army had deserted, her power was an illusion, and her enemies were drinking beer in the shadow of her greatest failure. Her eyes darted around at the faces staring back at her, no longer fearful but openly hostile. Cornered and desperate, she did the only thing she could think of. She pulled out her phone. "That's it," she hissed, her fingers stabbing at the screen. "I am calling the police. We'll see who has authority." A murmur of disbelief went through the crowd. She was actually doing it. She put the phone to her ear, her voice taking on a tone of frantic, performative victimhood. "Yes, I need to report a public nuisance and an illegal gathering at 128 Cypress Lane. The homeowner is unstable and is trespassing against my authority." "Yes, I'm the president of the Homeowners Association." "It's a very dangerous situation," she hung up with a look of venomous triumph. "The authorities are on their way. You've all made a very, very big mistake." 15 minutes later, a police cruiser rolled silently to the curb. Two officers got out, a man and a woman, their expressions weary and impassive. They were clearly not expecting a dangerous situation, but a routine suburban squabble. Brenda immediately intercepted them at the edge of the lawn, launching into a rapid-fire tirade. "Thank God you're here, officer. This woman," she said, pointing a trembling finger at Karen, "is in violation of numerous community bylaws. She has created a hazardous object in her pool. She's hosting an unpermitted gathering, and she is slandering the authority of our governing board." The male officer, whose name tag read Sandoval, held up a hand. "Ma'am, please, let's just calm down." He turned his gaze to Karen, who had walked over to meet them. "Ma'am, what's going on here?" "This is my home, officer," Karen said calmly. "I invited some neighbors over for a barbecue. This woman, Brenda Collins, has been harassing me for months, sending me illegal fines and threatening to take my home. She believes she's the president of an HOA that, according to the county, doesn't legally exist," Brenda sputtered. "That is a lie! I have our charter right here." She thrust a copy of the HOA bylaws at the officer. Officer Sandoval took the document and began to flip through it. Karen held out her own file. "And I have a certified copy of the official file from the Williamson County Clerk's office, officer. You can see on the final page it was never ratified. It was never legally recorded. It has no more legal weight than a grocery list." The officer took Karen's document. He spent a long moment comparing the two, his eyes lingering on the certified county stamp on Karen's copy and the blank space on Brenda's. He looked up, his expression unreadable, and handed both documents back. He then turned to Brenda, his voice polite but firm, with an unmistakable edge of official authority. "Ma'am," he said, his gaze unwavering, "based on this document from the county, it appears you are not the president of anything." Officer Sandoval's words, delivered with the flat, indisputable weight of the law, landed in the stunned silence of the backyard like a judge's gavel. "Ma'am, it appears you are not the president of anything." Brenda stared at him, her mind refusing to process the statement. The world she had built, ruled, and perfected had just been declared a fiction by an armed representative of the state. For a moment, her face was a terrifying blank canvas of shock. Then the canvas tore. "You're wrong," she shrieked, a raw, ragged sound that made several people flinch. "I have a charter! I have bylaws! I have a lawyer! This community needs me!" Her voice climbed an octave with each declaration, teetering on the edge of hysteria. The officer's partner, a young woman with a calm demeanor, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we need you to lower your voice. This is a civil matter. But right now you are on private property and the homeowner has asked you to leave." "I am not leaving," Brenda screeched, pointing a shaking finger at Karen. "This is her fault. She's destroying everything. Look!" She gestured wildly at the scene, the laughing neighbors, the forbidden beer bottles, the triumphant, waterlogged sofa. To her, it was a portrait of anarchy. To everyone else, it looked like freedom. George, who had been standing behind her like a granite statue, finally seemed to grasp the situation. His alliance had been with power, and the power had just evaporated. He looked at the police officers, at the 50 angry neighbors, and then at the unhinged woman beside him. His face, usually red with bluster, was pale. He took a half-step back, a small but profound act of desertion. Brenda saw it. The betrayal was the final straw. A choked sob escaped her lips. She spun around, her face a grotesque mask of fury and tears, and stormed back down the driveway. She fumbled with the key to her golf cart, her hands shaking too much to fit it into the ignition. Giving up, she abandoned the cart and simply ran, a frantic, undignified sprint down the perfectly manicured street until she disappeared around the corner. A stunned silence followed her departure. Then someone started to clap. A slow, rhythmic applause that was quickly picked up by everyone in the yard. It wasn't a cheer of victory. It was a release of a decade's worth of pent-up frustration. Karen watched George wordlessly get into the abandoned golf cart and drive it away, not even looking back. The party continued, but the energy had shifted. The giddy rebellion was replaced by a sense of sober possibility. The neighbors weren't just celebrating the end of a tyrant. They were contemplating the beginning of a community. Bill, Maria, and a few others gathered with Karen around her patio table, the certified county document sitting in the middle like a declaration of independence. "So, what happens now?" Maria asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. "Now," Karen said, a new and unfamiliar confidence in her voice, "we get our money back." The following Monday, Karen and a delegation of a dozen neighbors were in Arthur Vance's office. Armed with David's meticulous records and a stack of sworn affidavits from residents detailing years of fines, Arthur drafted a letter that was less a legal threat and more a declaration of unconditional surrender. It was sent to Brenda George, the now officially resigned Barry, and the law firm of Pruitt, Sneed and Associates. It outlined a clear case for a class action lawsuit on the grounds of widespread fraud and illegal collection practices. It demanded a full, immediate refund of all fines collected plus interest, and a complete dissolution of the illegitimate HOA corporation, with any remaining funds to be distributed equally among the homeowners. The final line was a masterpiece of legal checkmating. Should you choose to contest this, please be aware that we will also be filing a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office to investigate potential criminal charges. Pruitt, Sneed and Associates, the bottom feeders who specialized in intimidation, folded in less than 24 hours. They sent a curt letter stating they no longer represented Ms. Collins or the Cypress Creek HOA. The fight went out of Brenda completely. 2 weeks later, every homeowner received a cashier's check in the mail, refunding every cent they had ever paid in fines. Barry, eager to avoid prosecution, had liquidated the HOA's accounts and handled the distribution with terrified efficiency. The for sale sign went up in front of Brenda's house the next day. It was a discreet, tasteful sign, perfectly aligned with the sidewalk, just as the rules she'd invented would have demanded. No one saw her leave. The moving van came and went while most people were at work. The house sold in a week. The neighborhood collectively exhaled. Life in Cypress Creek Estates began to change in small, wonderful ways. Brightly colored wind chimes appeared on porches, tinkling in the breeze. The elderly couple reinstalled their bird feeder, and the lawn was soon filled with cardinals and blue jays. Maria's son left his tricycle on the lawn overnight and found it in the same spot the next morning. People started painting their front doors colors other than beige and off-white. The neighborhood didn't descend into chaos. It began to look like a place where people actually lived. They held a community meeting a month later, this time on their own terms. They voted to legally and properly form a new, legitimate homeowners association. The bylaws were simple, focused only on essential shared maintenance and safety, with no rules about aesthetics. Karen was unanimously elected president, a position she accepted with a wry smile. Her only official act in the first month was to plan a neighborhood-wide potluck. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Karen stood by her shimmering clean pool. A local company, owned by Bill's cousin, had removed the sofa for free, calling it a civic service. As she looked out at the families laughing and talking on her lawn, she felt a sense of peace she thought had been lost to her forever. She was no longer just the grieving widow of 128 Cypress Lane. She was Karen, the woman who had taken on a bully and won. The woman who had finished her husband's fight. She thought of David's note, the one that had started it all. They're a bluff, all of it. He had known the truth all along. He had trusted she would find it, and that she would know what to do. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but it wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of gratitude. Maria came and stood beside her, holding a plastic cup of lemonade. "You know," Maria said quietly, looking out at the vibrant, happy scene, "it's a much nicer neighborhood without a tyrant." Karen took a sip of her own lemonade, the cool sweetness a welcome balm. "It's not just a neighborhood anymore," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "It's a community."